I'm going to talk about something that's very, very scary, and that is bloom thinning. And we have a new tool to help you decide, or if you've decided you might want to try bloom thinning with a caustic thinner, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. This pollen tube growth model. So I'll go through that reasonably quickly. It's not terribly complicated. You kind of have to try it and work with it a little bit to understand it, but I'll try and explain it the best I can. So what is the pollen tube growth model? It's actually was developed by Keith Yoder with some help from Washington State folks. And in Washington, they do a lot of bloom thinning with caustic bloom thinners. And they were looking for a way to better time their sprays because they were just basing it on the degree of bloom. So what this model does is it models the rate of pollen tube growth from when pollen is deposited by bees, presumably, on the stigma and moves down the style. You can see the stigma is the top part of the style right here, or the pistil it's sometimes called. This whole structure is the pistil. And when pollen gets deposited there, depending on temperature and the length of this style, there's a little pollen tube that grows down and fertilizes the ovule in the ovary there. That's how pollination occurs. Once that happens, presumably the fruit is set and will start to grow. So if you apply a caustic thinner, a caustic meaning a phytotoxic thinner, you want to let some of this pollination happen, or you want the pollen tube to grow down and fertilize the ovule so that a fruit started. So that's what the goal of caustic thinning is. And this pollen tube growth model helps you time that spray so you don't, you have some flowers pollinated and some aren't, okay? Where is the pollen tube growth model? Well, fortunately, for those of you that have weather stations on NUA, it's on the NUA website. If you go to nua.cornell.edu, you can get to it by selecting crop management and then the pollen tube growth model. You can also type directly into your browser ptgm.nua.cornell.edu, and that'll get you there. All right, the steps to use the pollen tube growth model. Once you get to the website, you'll need to add and set up a block, and that's fairly simple. You have to name the block. You have to select an apple variety. So this is a little problematic. I'm not so sure it's worth using this on Macintosh, but you can't really use it on Macintosh effectively because it's only really been tested on these varieties. I suspect in our neck of the woods, we don't care about Red Delicious or Pink Lady that much. Some of you may. But maybe for Gala, Fuji, and Honeycrisp in particular, this model is very useful. And then you have to pick a NUA station. Once you select the state you're in, it'll give you a drop-down list of all the NUA stations in your state. And you can set this up with multiple blocks. Once you start using it, the information is cached in your browser. So every time you go back on your computer to use the pollen tube growth model, all that information is saved, okay? And then after you set up a block and you choose the block, you have to select a start date for the model to start basically modeling the pollen tube growth. So this is not the easiest thing in the world to do. There's some kind of, the way I look at it, I've seen 5 to 10% of bloom open. That doesn't seem like very much to me. But if you think about it, well, and this is, you can also base it on the number of flowers open for the desired crop load. And actually, I stole this picture from one of Phil Schwalier's presentations out at Michigan State University. So if you have a tall spindle orchard like this, and typically there's, upwards of 200 flower clusters with 5 or 6 flowers per cluster. So, you could have 1,000 flowers on there. But when 100 flowers are open, not flower clusters, 100 individual flowers are open on those trees is when, for example, you start the clock ticking. I like to think of it maybe more at about 20% bloom. When 20% of the flowers are open, you could start the model. So it's a little subjective there, but you have to pick a starting time. You also have to measure the average style length. It's not very hard to do. We go out and quickly, I like to do about 25 or 30 of the flowers, but insert some kind of measure. Some people use a caliper. The little thinning gauge works pretty well. You can see that these styles here are about 10 to 11 millimeters. So you need to either record that. Like I said, I think if you do 25 or 30, and this is by variety, that's sufficient. And you can calculate your own average and type that in, or you can type in the individual style lengths and the application will calculate it for you. They range, depending on variety, mostly it can depend on the year a little bit and the growing season, or what the pre-bloom period is like. But they kind of range from 6 to 10 millimeters, but within a variety, they'll typically be all within 1 or 2 millimeters. But you should go out and measure those because that's important to know what that is. All right, after you get your block set up, you start the model running, you enter the average style length, you can go back and run this. You can check this as often as you want, and you will see a chart. This is from last year, so it's a fully completed chart. But this chart basically shows you what percent of the style has been the pollen tube has been growing down the style. And once that reaches approximately 100% here, I just picked 91% just to show you, because it's kind of interactive, but once it reaches close to 100%, that's telling you that presumably all those flowers that you originally, those 100 flowers, for example, that were open, the pollen tube's grown down the style and the ovaries have been fertilized, and then you can go in with a caustic bloom thinner and basically waste every other flower that's open or started to open, because you don't need those anymore. I don't know if that makes sense, but it should kind of, you know what I'm saying? And it's a little hard to wrap your head around it at first. But once you do that, if you apply a caustic bloom spray at that point in time, you can then restart the clock ticking in case you want to do a second spray. So what you see here is basically we put a bloom thinner on here, and I said I want to start the second spray. It started right here. Now, actually, I never put on a second spray last year, but that's what it looks like. And again, once this reaches about 100%, would be time to put on a second spray. And actually, I think I have a chart here. Oh yeah, I just kind of put this in here saying this is kind of what you can see right about here would be time to put on your second caustic bloom thinner. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to understand, I think. It can basically give you the time by the hour to go put that spray on when all that fertilization that you want to happen has occurred. So, last year at the UMass Orchard in Belchertown, I tried and used this on Honeycrisp. I applied a bloom thinner on the 18th of May, according to what the model said, at nearly 100% pollination. And a couple days later, this was lime sulfur. I'll talk more about that in a minute. This was lime sulfur. A couple days later, I went out and looked and said, oh my goodness. But in retrospect, I think that's what you need to do to make it work. So in addition to burning the petals, you can kind of see the lime sulfur residue on the foliage, but it basically desiccates that style too, so prevents pollination. This was maybe, hopefully, the flower that got pollinated. I put the bloom thinner on, and all these, it burned the style enough such that they won't get pollinated. Okay, assuming this was the king flower, this was one of my 100 flowers opened when I started the model running. And whoa, lo and behold, on the 29th of May, just over 10 days later, I don't believe any other chemical thinners were put on this block, but it's kind of irrelevant because I looked at other Honeycrisp blocks where chemical thinners had been applied, and they were quite a bit different. Most of those still had 2 or 3 fruits on them. Whereas just about where I applied the lime sulfur, just about every spur was down to 1 Honeycrisp fruit. So I was, needless to say, pretty impressed. I thought this was an excellent result from that lime sulfur spray, and really impressed. However, at the end, really with Honeycrisp, you kind of need just 1 fruit for every 2 spurs. So these trees were ultimately still overcropped and needed some hand touch-up thinning. But it was a really nice look after the lime sulfur spray. All right. Now, I did apply that lime sulfur spray to control scab. However, lime sulfur is also rather caustic, phytotoxic to foliage and flowers. It, as I mentioned, will prevent pollen germination. It kind of desiccates the style. It's also a photosynthesis inhibitor. So in addition to preventing that pollination, it can inhibit photosynthesis in the time after bloom and result in a little thinning on that. I wasn't too shy. I applied it at 4%. You know, I think somewhere between 2 and 4%, if you want to be a little shy, is where to go. Maybe do 3 gallons per 100 gallons. I put the 80% bloom in there. Don't pay too much attention to that. It's kind of the old method of doing it. Use the pollen tube growth model if you can. Now, some people suggest you add oil. I did not add oil. I talked to a couple of growers in Washington. Some do oil, some do not. I think I'm a little more comfortable not using oil and maybe upping my rate of lime sulfur a little bit. So that's one option. The other option is to use ATS. I think Dwayne has talked a little bit about ammonium thiosulfate before. It's a nitrogen source. It's purely a caustic thinner. The suggested rate is 1.5 to 3 gallons per 100 gallons. It will thin, but the general perception out there is less dependable than lime sulfur. I suspect lime sulfur is a little easier to get. And again, you're going to be putting it on for disease control at that time period. It will help prevent scab. So I haven't used ATS. I would, at this point in time, recommend lime sulfur based on my one experience with that. So pros and cons of using the pollen tube growth model and the caustic bloom thinner. You know, spray conditions can be unfavorable at the timing when the bloom spray is indicated. You know, if it's raining, windy, high moisture will actually make the thinner work better. But, you know, if you're supposed to put that on at a certain hour and the weather's bad, you might not be able to do it. You need to think about, you know, whether you've had any frost damage, how the bee activity's been. You know, the assumption is you probably wouldn't do bloom thinning if you suspected frost or freeze damage and you notice that bee activity was not particularly great. The interaction of the mother, the variety, and the father pollen source is not 100% well understood. That could play into its effectiveness. Like I mentioned, there's no pollen tube growth model for Macintosh or other varieties. But, you know, any opportunity coincides with some risk. If you have a heavy bloom, if you don't have any frost injury, if you have Honeycrisp, I highly recommend trying some lime sulfur bloom thinning. Did I mention, I thought I had a slide that suggests, you know, why do we do bloom thinning? One reason is it will help with return bloom, and it really gets you down to where you need to be. You may still have to do some chemical thinning or hand thinning, but it's a big start. I just wanted to mention, you know, we're coming up to the bloom period where frost or freeze. It's been, needless to say, an interesting spring. You know, if you have temperatures of between 25 and 28 during king bloom, I would not be using blossom thinning. But if it only goes down to 30 or so, it's probably pretty safe. So these temperatures are pretty accurate in general. Keep an eye on the temperatures during bloom and realize you might have some frost or freeze injury if they drop below these levels. If you want to know more about the pollen tube growth model, Phil Schweier has a pretty good video. If you search MSU fruit on YouTube, he explains it with far more detail, has more time than I have. You could go look at that. One more thing, I wanted to just briefly mention this Prebloom foliar nutrient spray. The tight cluster through the pink stage is a good time to be putting this on. It might be particularly useful where we've had long extended periods from green tip. Green tip, by the way, was about March 31st, so we're going on 1 month, and we're barely at tight cluster to pink. Sometimes we can get from green tip to petal fall easily within a month. But anyways, during these long extended, those spurs are running on just carbohydrate reserves. There's very little photosynthesis going on at this point. So a little nitrogen, 3 pounds of feed grade urea. This is all in 100 gallons dilute spray from tight cluster through pink, plus some boron, 1 pound of soluble zinc. Use a label rate. It was mentioned to me, and it's true, there's a lot of these, kind of general purpose foliar nutrient sprays. They all typically have some nitrogen in them and some micronutrients. They're fine too, that will help. And then I was also reminded at petal fall, again, to help with fruit set, and if the conditions had been kind of rough through bloom, you could put another urea spray on. At that time, probably more like 5 pounds of urea per 100 gallons of dilute spray is recommended. And we have a fact sheet on the UMass Fruit Advisor, ag.umass.edu/fruit, publications, fact sheets, where you can get more details and information on that. Let me think. I think that's all I have.